Welcome to the Rooted Healing podcast, where we seek to deepen our kinship with the living world and with the great mystery that runs through us. This is a space where stories heal with words that weave us closer to our wild and daring natures, bringing together the expansive minds, topics, and ideas that help us heal, reimagine, and co-create the world we wish to thrive in.
It's important not to medicalise eco-anxiety as something that's wrong with you. It's not something to try and band-aid over because I think it's a legitimate, rational response to what's going on. It's blossoming into full-blown major depression for some people, so what can we actually do about it?
Sam Gandy is an ecologist, writer and researcher with a PhD in ecological science from the University of Aberdeen and an MRes in entomology from Imperial College London. He has been involved with the cutting edge of psychedelic research, working as scientific assistant to the director of the Beckley Foundation and as a collaborator with the Psychedelic Research Group at Imperial College London. This conversation spans across easing existential anxiety, psilocybin-assisted therapy, and beavers. Oh, I love them. Could social projects of regeneration be married with psychedelic-assisted therapy? Something we would love to explore with Rooted Healing. Can we, for example, treat eco-anxiety and depression with groups reintroducing this keystone species across Britain? What other ways can we innovate more nature connection whilst also healing our inner landscapes? And on the topic of psilocybin, we are creating some very nourishing, transformational psilocybin gatherings in the Netherlands for 2023. So do make sure you're signed up to our newsletter to be the first to know more and get early bird rates. Visit rootedhealing.org to sign up. Please don't forget to rate and review the show if you're enjoying it, and check out our community Patreon page linked in the show notes. A big thank you to our new patrons, Vivian, Laura, Jenna, Carla, and Hannah. It means so much to have you in that space. Thank you. So without further ado, enjoy this episode with Sam Gandy. I'd like to start at the end. Dying to live. A lot of what you've researched and written about speaks to society's denial of death and how this can manifest in really life-damaging ways. And you wrote in an article, one way or another, we will all approach the end of life. We are all terminal, and existential anxiety can be a burden long before this. And you continued, unconscious denial of death can have a demoralizing effect on an individual, potentially affecting loved ones and the community as a whole, end quote. So how has your research into the therapeutic use of psychedelics offered a counterculture to this suppression? And how did you find yourself such an advocate for this healing modality in the first place?
I feel that our care for dying people and, palliative care in general is important, but it's like really underfunded and undersupported. I think mainstream medicine is very good at keeping people alive, but it's not so good at kind of dealing with the end of people's lives. And, we're good at, we can provide painkillers and sort of make people physically comfortable, but I think in some cases people's existential or spiritual needs they're not really being met or addressed as well as they could be. I was sort of intrigued by some of the work that's been done on this. So using psilocybin, the active compound in magic mushrooms, I think so Johns Hopkins University and New York University in the States have been doing some work on this, and they're kind of moving on now to phase 3 trials where psilocybin has been administered to people with a terminal cancer diagnosis who have existential anxiety about their sort of mortality and remaining time on Earth. And the results that have sort of come back from these studies have been really quite robust and impressive. I think arguably the most robust and impressive of any results from any psychedelic research yet conducted. So beyond just the treatment of, say, major depression and things like that, it seems that psychedelics have a particular utility here to help people come to terms with their mortality and make peace with it and make the most of their remaining time. That has important ripple effects because it doesn't just obviously impact the individual in question, but it impacts all their loved ones and their family, the nature through which they die. So I feel that in our society that kind of death is something of a taboo. We don't really talk about it much or think about it. Medically, it's viewed something like almost a failure rather than an inevitable aspect of life. So I feel there could be reciprocal benefits here by kind of bringing death more into the open and sort of embracing it and find ways of sort of dealing with it. We're less likely to maybe shun it and to our loss as well. You hear these things about people on their deathbed. They're looking back at their life and they may well have regrets about things they did or things they didn't do. And there's a tremendous sense of levity and wisdom that can come through facing the end of your life. But I don't think it has to come at the very end of your life. And I feel like these powerful altered states experiences, such as a high dose psychedelic experience, but also things like near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences as well. I think one of the first papers I wrote was sort of looking at these three big transformative experiences that humans can undergo. And I think individually, people had been sort of making the case, well, these experiences seem to reduce people's fears around death and dying. But I hadn't really seen much work sort of trying to kind of link them all and see like what overlap is there going on there between these experiences. How could they be used in a kind of, I guess, a palliative care or sort of reducing death anxiety context. And it seems to me a very important thing that's worthy of looking at because none of us are getting out here alive. We're all going to die, and I think sort of having these options on the table is really important.
And how, as an ecologist, did you find your way to psilocybin mushrooms in this research?
I started doing zoology at Imperial. Just so happened at that time that psilocybin mushrooms were legal. You could walk into Camden and you could just buy tubs of fresh mushrooms on the street there. For some reason, the laws at the time stated that they were a foodstuff, and then if you processed or dried them in any way, they became a Class A drug. So there was a loophole that people sort of exploited while they could before it was inevitably closed. So I happened to kind of overlap in time in London when psilocybin mushrooms were accessible. I was curious. I hadn't really dabbled with substances really before then, perhaps apart from a little bit of cannabis on occasion. But I was curious and I wanted to sort of know what was up with that, and so had these mushrooms, and the first experience going to an electronic nightclub in London was pretty harrowing for myself and my friend that did it, but we learned sort of the set and setting rule quite strongly from that. So for future experiences, approaching it with a bit more humility and respect and planning it more and stuff, and we're rewarded for doing so. But I kind of knew even from that first harrowing experience that I'd encountered something really interesting, something deep, something powerful, something quite mysterious. And I wanted to sort of meet it on better terms, I guess you could say. I've got the kind of mind that gets engrossed by things and interested in things. And once I'd had those early experiences, I wanted to know more. I wanted to know, what do we think's happening in the brain? Like, how have indigenous groups been using these substances for centuries? What happened in the 1960s? What actually went down there? How are these things being used as medicines or therapy aids? So I kind of started to read and research. I started to attend a few events. I did a few talks. I started to edit and write a few scientific papers, and then I eventually ended up working at the Beckley Foundation, which kind of helps fund and instigate psychedelic research. And sort of almost exactly the same time, I was invited to come on board the Centre for Psychedelic Research at Imperial. They, sort of invited me to come on board to collaborate on looking at how psychedelics affect people's relationships with nature or their connection to nature. So that's my kind of core focus, and I guess that was my sort of way in. This is important. This needs more light kind of shining on it.
I want to read a quote that you included in one of your articles from Albert Hofmann, and I think it was in his dying days. Quote, alienation from nature and the loss of the experience of being part of the living creation is the greatest tragedy of our materialistic era. It is the causative reason for ecological devastation and climate change. Therefore, I attribute absolute highest importance to consciousness change. I regard psychedelics as catalyzers for this, end quote. And I'm curious what your thoughts are, because as far as I can tell, the therapeutic use of psychedelics is being studied from within a clinical room, maybe with a plant or two in the corner, music from a speaker, I'm not sure exactly. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on maybe marrying the worlds of nature facilitation, which you also do, with this research and psychedelic therapeutic practices.
It's a good question and a kind of rich topic. So I've tried to kind of make the case in my own work for kind of basically incorporating more nature themes, content, settings into therapeutic psychedelic experiences. So right now in the UK, we're fairly limited in options here specifically, in that it's kind of, there's no way you can kind of dose someone up with a psychedelic and take them outside into nature. It has to happen in a kind of monitored, researched hospital setting. And there's no sort of wavering on that. So my thoughts are, well, if you can't take people out into nature, at the very least, you can bring some nature into the clinical space. Possibility of, having a few plants, or even bringing your own plant, one that has personal value to you into the space. I mean, from a clinical perspective, people tend to be lying down on a sofa or a bed. They have headphones with a carefully selected playlist of music to take them through the stages of the experience, and they're wearing eye shades, and they've been primed to go inwards and to shine a light into the dark corners of their mind, confront anything like monsters or shadows that might be there, and ask, what you're doing in my mind, and to also to trust, surrender, let go, and in and through. But as a basic approach, it seems to work quite well. But I really like the ideas of having group ceremonies or sessions in nature, so you can like cultivate nature connectedness potentially, and also social connectedness or communitas at the same time, because these things seem to naturally synergize anyway. So there's definitely other ways that we can use psychedelics that I think are beneficial, that fall outside the kind of quite individualistic, contained clinical approach.
Yeah, my background is very much the indigenous approach and sitting in ceremony and being in nature. And I guess I meet some resistance hearing how controlled the environment has to be. It makes sense. Obviously, it's a clinical study, and there's we have a method of scientific exploration that's very much set in controlled experimentation. But I also feel a sense of like, oh man, this Western need to control and eliminate and but I do get it. I just feel like there's such a need to touch and really be in nature, and I can see what you're saying with not necessarily needing to marry psychedelics or entheogens with being in nature, because nature is magical enough. I just know that a huge key for me and so many people's journeys that I've witnessed has been that putting their hands into the earth and really connecting. So yeah, thank you for speaking to that.
Yeah.
You've written some pretty scary statistics about, a survey in 2016 found that 74% of children in the UK now spend less than an hour a day playing outside, which is less than the UN mandated minimum for prison inmates. Another survey found that children in the UK are more able to identify Pokemon characters than common wildlife species. And just on a side note, witnessing my nephews and nieces' relationships with their phones, I'm really not surprised by this.
Yeah.
This retreat from nature brings its own mental health toll, given that spending time in nature and feeling connected to it is strongly correlated with well-being, vitality, and life satisfaction, end quote. And I'm studying an MSc at the moment with a school teacher who said that 3 students committed suicide last year. And I'm hearing these sort of stories coming in dribs and drabs, and there's this real feeling of, oh my goodness, this is a pandemic. And you've written about the underview effect defined by technology and the disconnected self. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on how we can systematically and urgently address this pandemic that feels way more dangerous than the pandemic that's just changed the world, of disconnection and anxiety.
Wow. You know what? I mean, I don't know if I've got any good solutions there. I think it's a tough issue to grapple with. I mean, so firstly, technology isn't going anywhere, on a broad scale, at least. We can't just disband from technology and go and run back into the caves or whatever, because there's simply not enough caves. But also technology is sort of wired into our society now. It's a fundamental aspect of our lives, and I think it will be moving forward. But that being said, I don't believe that technology is intrinsically bad either. Certainly not. Obviously it makes our lives simpler and more pleasurable in many ways, but it's very much about how it's used and the intent behind it. So we know from some of the work that's been done that increasing sort of usage of electronic entertainment technology and smartphone usage and things like this seem to be kind of exacerbating disconnect from nature, particularly among the young. As people are becoming more technologically interconnected, in some sense, they're becoming more disconnected from the world around them, from nature. And obviously, overall, there tends to be less wildlife in urban settings. It's part of the issue with nature disconnection is we're an increasingly urbanizing species. About over half of all humans live in cities, and by 2050 it's going to be closer to 3/4, I think. And so, but cities don't have to be nature deprived. I mean, if you look at the case of Singapore, it's done amazing stuff in terms of biophilic design there, and but at the same time there is nature to be seen in cities, even if there's less of it. And it's about being aware and curious and stuff. And then as well, obviously making time to be unplugged from technology. If you're going out into nature and if you're going walking, if you're going trekking, or whatever you might be doing, you're going to lose out on a good chunk of the benefits if you're just walking around with your head glued to your phone. I guess it's kind of making boundaries between having technology time and not technology time. I don't have any oven-ready solutions to this kind of problem. But I'm wondering if you have any thoughts here.
Well, I guess what comes to mind is school. And if school now is also heavily based within technology, I think kids generally are now being introduced to studying with iPads and not having school books anymore. And I get it. It's definitely the direction we seem to just be continuing to head. But maybe if there could be an incentive backed by the clear science of mental health and physical health for the government to implement a certain hours of day that needs to be outside within the schooling framework. How can some classes be taught with more outdoors stuff in mind? And maybe that's just, heading into forest school and
no,
I don't know, ward off territory or
yeah,
whatever.
no, I think that's really important, actually. I've heard some interesting stuff recently about a growing number of schools teaching kids about growing vegetables.
Yeah.
And they get to grow and then harvest and then eat their own vegetables. And I think something like that is great, because by doing that, you're not just going out into nature and not really sort of like necessarily taking much in. You're interacting with it in quite a sort of fundamental way. You, by nature, with what you're doing, you have to be aware of your vegetables and like how they're doing and keeping an eye on them, and then you get to like consume them as well after your time and energy that you put in. So you get that sort of like appreciation back. And I think, yeah, those kind of emotional dimensions are important aspects of nature connectedness. It's not a kind of objective, it's not principally like an objective knowledge-based thing. That's what, interestingly, the scientific research has shown, is it's not a scientific knowledge-based thing. It's much more about direct experience, cultivating curiosity, and just taking the time to be aware of what's going on around you. And like, we're all good at this. This is wired into our Paleolithic DNA. This is sort of it's all sort of like a fundamental part of us, and we can kind of quickly learn how to sort of pick up on the sounds and the sights and the smells of the natural world around us, because there's information being transmitted all the time that we can tune into if we so please, and that is good for us to do that.
I wonder if we could also pitch for a national movement of turning school playground spaces into really biodiverse nature regenerative projects, things like that, meeting conservation and regeneration with our innate need to be connected from a mental health perspective.
Yeah. Well, no, I like the sound of that a lot. As an aside to say, growing veg, yeah, having a little patch of land that's sort of being managed with biodiversity in mind on a school ground, I think is really, really nice idea. I mean, I think they've now established a GCSE in natural history quite recently as well, which I think sort of like a good step in the right direction. I think we could be doing a lot more, and I think we need to be kind of working with younger children as well and getting them engaged. Yeah. So experiential learning, rather than like learning about it on a computer screen or on a blackboard, like actually getting out there into the fresh air. And an important barrier to nature connectedness is biophobia, is fear of nature and fear of wildlife. And if people don't have those childhood encounters with nature and those experiences, I think that's much more likely to emerge. The scale of our kind of disconnect from nature, at least in our society, is such that we need a variety of approaches all acting in synergy, I think. I don't think there's not a single solution here that's going to win the day. I feel like we need to be sort of working on multiple fronts, in terms of like this kind of experiential learning that we've talked about, potentially using psychedelics, restoring ecosystems, restoring biodiversity, increasing the access to nature in the UK. So there's huge inequality in the sort of the access to nature that people have, and people of lower socioeconomic kind of incomes, they tend to have less access to green space and nature. So we need to sort of redress that as well. In some cases, encouraging people's ecological literacy, like, just because you've got nature nearby doesn't necessarily mean you're going to kind of use it or sort of be aware of why you'd want to even.
Yeah, it reminds me of your TEDx talk called Egoism to Ecoism, and how we all need to find that interconnectivity within the web of life and start acting more like life acts, with that symbiotic everyone doing our part in our different way and it creating a really biodiverse, powerful web.
Yeah.
Can you explain what baseline syndrome is and why it's so important that we, from this stance, protect and create biodiverse natural habitats, even, like you said earlier, in the middle of a city or on the edge of a town, for example?
So, yeah, shifting baseline syndrome is a quite insidious and nefarious thing where, so I think it was a fisheries scientist who first kind of coined the term, because he'd been asked to assess what the baseline level of fish populations were. And he had a thought that, like, well, I'm not measuring the baseline levels of fish in the sea. I'm measuring the already depleted levels of fish in the sea since humans started fishing. So that sort of highlights kind of what it's about. And it's because humans have been affecting biodiversity and wildlife populations for a while now, for centuries, for millennia. But we only really tend to think within the limits of our lifespan. For me, for instance, in my life, I've noticed that the amount of butterflies that I see in the summer on the buddleia bushes around has gone down. I noticed that at night, driving at night, I see a lot less moths in the headlights of the car than I used to when I was young. And that's just my own anecdotal kind of observations. But we tend to be kind of constrained by the sort of limited view of our lifespans, and we don't often think, what was the state of nature or what was biodiversity like a lifespan prior to our lifespan, or a century ago, or like several centuries ago. So we're taking the present moment and the state of nature and wildlife as kind of the baseline for what is good/normal nature. And that's not true at all. That what we're taking as the normal baseline is a much depleted shadow of what it once was. And this is a bit, so remember someone on Twitter, for example, they were defending the very depleted, sparse highlands of Scotland. They should be forested. I know we think of Scotland as a beautiful wild place, and it is a beautiful place, but it is very much sculptured by the human hand. And those highlands and those hillsides, they should have trees on them, but they don't. And this person was actually defending this depleted hillside simply because it was what's familiar to him. Got other people like, oh, well, trees will spoil the view. It's like, well, I think it would look way better with trees. People will defend that which is familiar to them, irrespective of its ecological value or its value, its ability to support other forms of life. We need to be aware of this process, because as nature becomes more depleted, more degraded, so the UK is considered one of the most nature depleted parts of planet Earth, actually, in terms of the amount of our original biodiversity, or the original total species we used to harbour here. We've lost pretty much more than anywhere else in the world, and our nature disconnection is sort of the kind of highest in Europe of surveyed nations as well. And I think these things probably interact. So we need to be aware of this process, because it results in this constant, over time, ratcheting down of what we consider good nature to be, and good sort of wildlife or good biodiversity to be. And if we're not careful, that will just lead to consistently lowering standards of what we consider a nature-rich environment to be. And this is why nature connectedness is interesting, because I think it highlights that this sort of feedback loop can go the other way. It doesn't have to be kind of a negative spiraling loop of doom. A study coming out again by the Derby Research Group, who are looking at nature connectedness, and they found like measures to enhance visible biodiversity in your local vicinity enhances your nature connectedness. It's correlated with nature connectedness. simply because you're having more interactions with nature on a day-to-day basis. And obviously nature connectedness then also predicts pro-nature behaviors. So you're more likely to do things to maintain or support that biodiversity. So that's kind of showing, that's sort of, it's the process in reverse. You're actually ratcheting up your expectations or hopes for what you think a nature-rich setting is like, and that will impact your nature connectedness and your well-being as well as ecosystem functioning and resilience in the wake of climate change. So there's really quite big bang for your bucks with sort of prioritizing the restoration of species, the restoration of biodiversity and wildlife. And it gives me a sense of hope in terms of ideally, I don't want to leave this world or this place like a even more depleted and degraded place. It would be great if it was in fact getting richer and more life enriched. I mean, maybe that's a big ask, but I'd at least try to sort of work towards that. I think in some way, or hope that we can as a collective.
Yeah, I love that. It makes me think of the interview I did with Joya and Lucy, who are filmmakers, and they said something profound just along the lines of the power of language when it comes to conservation and sustainability. It's like we don't want to sustain what already is. We don't want to conserve what already is. They say that they do stories of regeneration because that's where I think that's where we can catch people. That's where there can be such a deep sense of satisfaction because we can improve, we can regenerate and weave back a richer wildlife and habitat.
Yeah.
And I think, honestly, I think that's what could really pull people in. It's not just this like desperate grasping at reservation. It's hatching new life, which leads on to, I think, the part I'm most excited about in this conversation, which is your work with beavers. So tell me how you found your way to the beavers and what the potential psychological benefits of nature enrichment through their reintroduction here in Britain may be.
Sure. So I guess I've been following what's been going on with beavers in Britain, so both sides of the border, England and Scotland, and also actually in Wales, the stuff, there's a bit more sort of slowly. I'm interested in beavers, I think, for a few reasons. So firstly, they were part of our fauna here. They went extinct about 400 years ago from Britain, but they are very much part of our natural fauna and our landscape. And they, like us, are powerful ecosystem engineers. And like us, they shape their environment to suit their needs and wants. But unlike us, they tend to do it in a way that dramatically benefits many different forms of life that have co-evolved with them. I mean, scientists refer to beavers as a keystone species. And while there's a bit of debate about what actually sort of comprises a keystone species, some scientists think you should use that term only in sort of special cases. But I think the beaver as an animal is one such special case in that the eco-engineering that it does. So obviously they're known for felling trees, but from those trees they create dams on small waterways like streams and small rivers, and that in turn then creates wetlands. And wetlands are amazing for wildlife. So I think freshwater wetlands cover about 1 to 2% of the planet Earth's surface, but support 12% of all species. And we've lost about 90% of our wetlands here in the UK in the last century. And this animal creates these habitats round the clock for free, and it creates richer habitat than anything we can hope to replicate as well. They do a lot more than that, but relevant to what we're talking about here, I think that's the main sort of takeaway. Beavers are keystone species, and their presence creates habitat and maintains habitats that simply wouldn't exist otherwise. And I was thinking, well, given how biodiversity depleted we are here, and nature disconnected more generally. Like, what would be the potential implications of returning this creature to our landscapes and learning to coexist with it? If it can, as has been shown, increase biodiversity at the landscape scale as well. So this isn't a trivial sort of thing. This is at quite broad scale, particularly if they're widespread in the landscape. They also create what's been termed green space and blue space. So green space can be things like parkland, woodland, grassland, obviously vegetation dominated natural landscapes, and blue space, obviously water-based, so things like rivers and lakes and the seaside. But we know that green space and blue space, while both are beneficial, they're beneficial in slightly different ways to our mental health and well-being. But the funky thing about beavers is they make a mosaic mishmash of green and blue space, and also a sense of wilderness as well. We forget that, Britain is a very manicured, managed landscape. Our land managers here like to be in control, and they like to have things nice and ordered. And the thing that's quite exciting about beavers, and having gone to see them in Perthshire in Scotland, and I remember sort of seeing what the beavers were doing to this ecosystem, and they were taking down fairly large trees. They dammed up this really little stream and sort of turned it into a much more expansive waterway, and obviously that in turn was supporting a lot more life. But it just felt like I was in a proper little patch of wilderness. I really got the palpable sense that humans were no longer in control of this little bit of land. It was under control of something else. And it was like, this feels like I've gone back in time. It feels like I've gone back in time centuries to another time and place. And that was quite a special feeling, to feel that again on British land. So I wonder about that sense of wilderness as well could be restorative in its own way as well. And then I think the educational potential of beavers as well. They're charismatic, funny animals. They do interesting things. They look funny. And I feel like, in terms of what we touched on before with engaging children and sort of getting them interested, my feeling is that the beaver could be a great ambassador animal to help ignite an interest in nature because of the effects that they have. And the great thing about them as well is that you don't even need to see a beaver to kind of get a buzz on them being there, because you can very much see their presence. You can see all these trees that have been sharpened to pencil points, and you can see the wetland environments that are like hooching with wildlife of all kinds. That's quite special, I think. So I really hope and feel that we need to learn to coexist with this creature. Yes, there will be issues. We know from the research that the benefits of learning to coexist far outweigh the costs and potential issues. The people, however, who benefit from beavers are different to the people who bear the brunt of the costs. So people like landowners and farmers. So those people will need support to make this work. And I'm going to go off to Bavaria in Germany in a week and a bit to spend a week learning about how do you actually manage beavers? What options are there to kind of mitigating their impacts? And hopefully through that, bring some knowledge back that might be hopefully wielded to kind of promote coexistence between humans and beavers.
So can you explain a little bit more about why they became extinct? I know that there was mass cullings, but what was the real incentive, or were there many?
Well, I think there were a few reasons, actually. So firstly, and this is probably start off with one of the more minor ones. Apparently, they're really quite tasty. Not that I've tried, eating a beaver or anything, but so I think they were hunted for food to some degree, not their main principal sort of pressure. I think that the Catholic Church passed a law because they were aquatic animals and had that sort of funny looking tail. The Catholic Church at the time ruled that they were fish, so that they could be eaten on Fridays as an alternative to actual fish. But I don't know how much sort of implications that had for the beavers, but unfortunately for them, they had other things deemed very valuable by humans, and that was their pelts. Their fur is made sort of amazing quality, like waterproof hats. Like it was quite, because obviously that creature's evolved to live in aquatic environments, has an extraordinarily dense fur. A beaver hat was considered it would last a lifetime basically, and be waterproof and a high grade material back when we didn't have synthetic options and stuff. And then last but definitely not least, the castoreum, which is what beavers use for scent marking their territory, which is produced from their anal glands. And that was used as an early basis for early perfumes and things. So, and that was very much in demand and in vogue at the time. So unfortunately for beavers, they kind of had a lot about them that was appealing. Think about the gold rush that happened in the US or whatever, like back in the day. It was really, I would argue, a fur rush. You know, beavers were a big part of that. I mean, it's sort of, beavers in Europe at least came quite close to being wiped out altogether. And it was around the time their sort of populations were at a really low ebb. America was kind of discovered, and then, discovered by, Western folk or whatever. And then we went there and pillaged the beavers. Oh God, there's loads of beavers over there too. And so it kind of took the pressure off the Eurasian beaver right in the nick of time. And then the American beaver got annihilated instead and brought very low. But on both sides of the Atlantic now, populations of beavers are bouncing back, which is good.
Yeah, you touched upon the idea of the beaver really acting as a symbol of what we could do, of bringing people back to nature. And I feel like there's been some very ancient relevance to the beaver being a symbol of community. And I'm wondering, what symbolism can we denote to the beaver in a way that can help us reweave the beaver's spirit and wisdom back into our collective imagination and our folkloric sense of place, if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I'm speaking to a documentary filmmaker who's Canadian, and he was telling me about how the reverence for the beaver among some of the indigenous communities in Canada. And he was telling me some of the elders for some of the indigenous groups will go into schools and talk about the beaver and its role in the wider ecosystem to the kids, and which I thought was really cool. And then I spoke to someone recently. He told me, I think again, somewhere in the States, maybe not Canada, but this particular indigenous group there kind of viewed the beaver as a powerful connector because of its eco-engineering, because it touches the lives of so many other creatures that share that environment. It's seen as a very important keystone species, but sort of coming from a slightly different perspective. The beavers used to exist in Iran, even in quite arid settings. And it was interesting that in that part of the world, when beavers did exist there, it was against the law to harm or kill one, because it was known that they helped the landscape hold on to water, and that was deemed really important.
I almost see them as gatekeepers of our waterways and how sacred water is, and there's just so much story, isn't there, that could be woven in.
I like that. And I think as well, actually, it's just pinged into my head, what I've seen that's been really interesting is some of the indigenous groups in the Americas have been spearheading reintroduction programs. So animals such as the beaver, such as the bison and the condor, species that hold particularly important places in their social ecological keystone species. And it's been cool to hear that it's the indigenous groups who feel that these animals are part of their cultural identity. You know, we know the environmental benefits, we know the ecological benefits, or some of them at least, for having beavers back, but what about the psychological benefits? But also as well, what about the psychological issues that may arise as well? And then how do you deal with them?
And so what's your role with the beaver reintroduction here in the UK, and how can people support the beavers?
So I'm going to be starting a role as a nature recovery specialist or advisor with this environmental consultancy, Ecosulis, and they're experts on rewilding and eco-restoration, habitat creation. I guess it's in the pipeline. It's not quite happening yet, but I've heard whispers that there are plans for what's called a soft release, as in a wild, free-living release of beavers is planned, which is quite exciting because up until now, it's pretty much any beaver reintroductions into England have been in enclosures. So they're not in the wild, so to speak. Whereas I think now with beavers going to be made protected species in about a week from now, at the start of October, I think free living wild releases are potentially on the cards in some areas. And, I want that, but you can't just release beavers into the wild and then walk away. It's not that type of deal. They will require active management, and for people to know what they're doing in that regard, for people who are being impacted to have someone that's always at the end of a phone that they can contact and talk to. That's the model that's used successfully in Bavaria, where they reintroduced beavers about half a century ago. So they've had a long head start on us and having to kind of go through a few little knocks and bumps as the beaver population expands, but they've got a good system in place for how to sort of coexist with these creatures with minimal negatives and maximizing the positives. So I think there's a lot of good stuff we can learn from there.
I think that's really important when it comes to acts of conservation, because if we're always separating humans from the rest, then we're doing exactly what caused the problem in the first place. Our psychology is an intrinsic part of nature, and we are part of nature. So we have to take in that whole symbiotic view. So I really hope this goes well, and I think it's so amazing that you're a part of this project. And I guess we can send people to support the beavers as well. Oh
yes. So just to put it out there, so I'm not directly affiliated with this organisation at all, but the Beaver Trust are a great organisation that are working really hard, made up of a really good team of people, and they are working hard to reintroduce and integrate the beaver into Britain.
Yes, let's support the beavers. And it's like we were saying earlier, of just each finding our own thing that we can all symbiotically do to give back, to really practice reciprocity instead of just taking for our own benefit all the time. It makes me think of the idea that maybe there's a future where we could marry psychedelic-assisted therapy with initiatives of regeneration, because that would be the ultimate grounds for healing. So how do we create awe and intimacy with the natural world, and that broaden perspective and sense of purpose and community, because it brings people together.
Yeah.
And so what are your hopes? I feel like we've covered a lot of ground already, but in terms of being devoted to wild creatures and spaces like you are, what seeds can you plant for us to water in closing this conversation?
Well, I like what you just said there about, potentially bringing in psychedelics to nature restoration activities. I just before this interview had a call with a psychiatrist collaborator, and we've got a commentary paper being published, I think on Tuesday, trying to make a case for group nature restoration activities as a mental health intervention. So, we've got stacks of data to show that being in nature, having contact with nature benefits our well-being and our health. And I thought that's great. But given that we're experiencing multiple environmental crises and like biodiversity levels are declining in the UK still, what are the effects of actually rolling up our sleeves and getting out there and actually doing some nature restoration activities in groups as well? So you've got that social connectedness of doing this work together, collaborating as a group. Nature connectedness is not just the same as just having passive contact with nature. It's much more about engagement and observation, and it's a predictor of pro nature behaviors, but I think it's a reciprocal two-way thing where pro-nature behaviors are quite a direct hotline to enhancing nature connectedness as well. I think it goes both ways, using psychedelics like psilocybin, potentially in a group nature-based context. And then, we need to figure out better ways or more ways of like, how do we, when people have this blossoming or enhancement of connectedness that's commonly reported as a result of having a psychedelic experience, but then they like go back out and reintegrate into our fundamentally disconnected society, they're probably not going to maintain those, or maybe not going to maintain that connectedness long term. And that sort of seems to be the case. Like nature connectedness actually seems to be a bit more enduring from the limited data we've got, but other forms of connectedness seems to sort of, they last for a good few months and then they start to come down. So we need to figure out, rather than just having a revolving door approach, it's like, well, my connectedness is coming down, so I better go and get dosed again. I think a law of diminishing returns will set in there. So we need to be thinking about what we can do afterwards in our waking lives to sort of augment, sustain, or build on that connectedness. And I feel that group nature restoration and just community gardening, wildlife gardening projects, there could be quite a few potential options here, could be a really positive thing to do for people, be they a clinical population, say with depression or anxiety or something like that, but also just healthy people as well. I think it can lead to the betterment of well people. With or without psychedelics, I feel that this could be positive stuff to be working towards, particularly now with a growing tide of eco-anxiety as well. Growing numbers of people are feeling a sense of hopelessness and or despair in the wake of climate change, biodiversity loss, and other sort of high-level threats. It's important not to medicalize eco-anxiety as something that's wrong with you. It's not something to try and band-aid over, because I think it's a legitimate, rational response to what's going on. Yeah. There's a growing tide of this. It's an issue. It's blossoming into full-blown major depression for some people. So what can we actually do about it? And I think group-based nature restoration activities, particularly again as part of a social unit, like we are social beings, we're wired for connection, our spirit of collaboration is what got us to where we are as a species. So tapping into that and actually doing some nature restoration, that in turn can potentially increase ecological resilience of ecosystems. It can potentially increase biodiversity, which locally, which can impact people's nature connectedness. In terms of bang for one's buck, it seems pretty big and also a really good time to be thinking about this stuff and doing it.
Oh, I love that so much. I really do. And it's like the original sort of native approach to life of this reciprocity. That would be the perfect premise for an integration program. Like instead of just sitting in sharing circles, which is also really beautiful, but having a project of regeneration and wildlife restoration as an integration program would be amazing, I think.
I mean, I am lucky here, and we do have a nice big garden. And a few weeks ago, I went with my friend and we put up bat boxes just around, because I've never seen so many bats this year, ever here before as this year. So I'm thinking, well, bats are great. I want to provide more real estate for them. And there's so many different activities that one can potentially do. And I do feel that the social aspect is important, because that will bring people on board who maybe aren't like massive nature bods as well, and sort of get them potentially engaged. Yeah, making access to nature more equal and more equitable and stuff like that. And there's quite a few different leverage points here, I guess you could say, on broad scales, and then much more kind of local on the individual scale.
Thank you for being here with the Rooted Healing community. To become more embedded in our work and receive exclusive offerings from our podcast guests that will nourish you and enrich your healing journey, head over to patreon.com/rootedhealing to support the show from £1 a month. We also have a workshop coming up in London in January called Qualia, which is inspired by my MSc studies into consciousness, woven into a conceptual, explorative, somewhat psychedelic somatic journey that I will be guiding. And tickets for that will be on sale soon via our website or through psychedelicsociety.org.uk. I'm your host, Veronica Stanwell. Thanks for listening.